Today I'll be taking a look at all of the Onslaught meta tanks and putting them into tier list. Is your favorite tank, is it overpowered? Is it a decent choice, or is it absolutely throwing in every scenario? My name's Ladpad and welcome to the video. A quick caveat. In Onslaught, you cannot play your special reward tanks. Those are not available. You can't even play something with a Foch 155 because that is not available as well. Artillery is completely banned, and so if you're seeing a vehicle, a tier 10 vehicle that you love, for example, like I adore the Lion, it may not be eligible for this video because it must be a tech tree tank to be played in Onslaught. With that said, we are going to start it off with a pretty surprising vehicle. The Rheinmetall Panzerwagen is normally just a garbage tank. It is, compared to the other light tanks, very, very weak in a random battle setting. However, the Rheinmetall in this game mode is actually phenomenal, and that is because of some of the boosts that light tanks are currently getting from how the meta is set up. The Rheinmetall Panzerwagen is, just with the tank, has very good damage per minute, especially for a light tank. It is second after the Sheridan. However, it has high explosive rounds with 120 millimeters of penetration that just absolutely devastate in this game mode. And because there's fewer tanks, you don't need as much ammunition. One of the Rheinmetall's weaknesses is it can only hold about 35 rounds of ammunition. That is not a problem in this game mode. And so right off the bat, the DPM of the Rheinmetall, its incredible speed, all of these add up to making the Rheinmetall a very, very strong tank. The Rheinmetall lacks in some of its camo compared to its peers. However, because you are not relying on your view range a ton as a light tank in this game mode, that's another thing that where the Rheinmetall is normally very weak in, it actually isn't as important here. So the Rheinmetall, it's got excellent mobility. It's, I believe, the fastest of the regular tier 10 light tanks. It's got fantastic high explosive rounds, and then it gets a specific light tank boost. And this is going to apply to every regular light tank in this list, and that is because in this current iteration of Onslaught, if you break line of sight, you will stop being spotted after 3 seconds. And that is massive for the light tanks because after 3 seconds you're no longer spotted. You can equip the radio equipment. It's something I've never used in World of Tanks, but it has a very niche use in the Onslaught game mode. And that is, if you put on the radio equipment onto a light tank and onto the Rheinmetall in particular, your spotting is going to go from that 3 second mark to a 1 second mark. The radio equipment makes sure you're spotted 2 fewer seconds than what is normally allowed. And what that allows you to do is you can shoot, you'll be spotted for a singular second, and then after 1 second you'll be unspotted because that is a flat boost, it's not percentage based. And so in a Rheinmetall, you can flank around moving at 72, 75 kilometers per hour. You're going to be faster than all of the other light tanks. And then you can snipe in from the back. If you're using HE, you're getting about 3,300 damage per minute, and you will just start ripping opponents apart from the back. If you need to go in and brawl, you've still got that 2400 base DPM, and it's enough to allow you to put in several shots and still be useful even if you're not in your ideal scenario. Add on to that, the Rheinmetall and all the regular light tanks have the best ability in this game mode, and that is going to be the scout plane ability. If you can see where the enemy team is, especially in a 7-on-7 context, then you are just going to absolutely dominate. You're able to be more flexible than the enemy team. You're able to react to different scenarios, take advantage of certain timings. That's just not possible if you're lacking the scout plane ability. And so, because of this, the Rheinmetall is going to be absolutely OP. You're not going to bring it on every map. Something like Ensk, you don't need it. But on the vast majority of maps, this thing is just phenomenal. And it is nearly a must pick on a lot of different maps. I'm going to be ranking the light tanks later on the list. You should know that my Rheinmetall, because of the various things that I've put out there, the HE pen, the excellent damage per minute, the fantastic best-in-class speed, that's going to keep the Rheinmetall OP, and whereas the other light tanks would rise up this list, if the Rheinmetall didn't exist, they will be lower because of it, because they just pale in comparison to how strong this tank is in the current meta. The M4 Patton, this is a decent choice. There are better tanks at doing what it does. However, the pattern gets the Inspire ability, and that allows you to inspire your team, I believe, up to 35%, and that is just, I would say, the second strongest ability in this entire list. It's incredibly powerful. In our 7-on-7 matchups, I make sure to always have in every lineup one of the Inspire abilities, and so while I do think there are better tanks than the pattern, the fact that this has the Inspire ability arises it from where it would be bad straight into a decent alternative. If you lack something like a Centurion or Udas, then you may as well take a Patton in your games. The Sheridan, all the same things apply that I've said about the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen and the spotting changes. However, it's still light tank, and so if you can take a Rheinmetall, you'd rather have that. If you don't have one at all on anybody on your team, then it's a decent alternative, but I think you could have much better choices than this. And of course, I am talking about using this thing with the 105mm. Do not use the 152mm, because if you're using that, then you're going straight into throwing. The T-57 Heavy. This is actually a very solid tank in this game mode. I would hesitate between putting it in situationally OP and the decent alternative. The T-57 Heavy, its ability isn't the strongest, but it does have a lot of use for this tank. It's going to make you much more accurate, and it's going to make sure that you're spitting out shells at max rank at every 1.2 seconds. So that means you can unload an entire T-57 Heavy clip in just 3.6 seconds. That is phenomenal. However, this thing doesn't have armor. It's not particularly mobile, and so because of that, I'm going to leave it as a decent alternative. I'm happy to have a T-57 on my team, and it's going to be very useful, but it's not going to push the pace of the combat, and it's just got a lot of weaknesses that other tanks that'll go above it don't have. The T110E3, this is not a tank that I would recommend using on most maps. I've debated whether it could be, whether it might be really useful in a few different scenarios. However, the ability to completely hide your lower plate and not get pushed past just doesn't happen often enough. You could find, I think, a few scenarios, a few situations scattered amongst the maps where this would be really strong. However, I think those are so rare and few and far between that it's not going to be situationally OP. I'll say it's a decent alternative, bordering on bad, because I think you can take advantage of these things. Also, its ability, you're getting a boost to the engine power, which is nice, but it's not game changing. The bigger part of it is every time you're shot, your reload is reduced by 5 seconds. However, that ability comes into play less than you might think, because if you're playing against a smart team, they're not going to waste shells trying to shoot you and improve your reload. So I'm leaving this at the bottom of decent alternatives. The T110E4, I think this thing is basically an E3 but worse. You don't get the armor of the E3, and you really don't get any massive upside. And instead of them shooting you and improving your reload like you might get in an E3, they're going to shoot you and they're going to penetrate you, and then you're going to be dead. And so I'd put the E4 in a bad choice. The E5 it's a good tank. It's got a lot of damage per minute. This Cupola is a weakness, but in the all-out brawl scenario that so happens in Onslaught, this thing can actually do really, really well. However, I think it's overshadowed by a tank that we will see later on, so I'm going to leave it in the decent alternatives. However, I wouldn't mind having one of these things, and there's a good case to make that it's going to be useful in a lot of scenarios. One last remark about its ability: it's not great. It improves your reload by just a small percentage, and it can get you a little bit of healing, but it's not a team-wide effect, and it doesn't tend to swing entire fights. So I'm going to leave this. I would actually put it behind the Patton. The M5Y. If you're going to play a hold down heavy, you may as well play the E5 or the tank we're going to discuss later on. So I just can't see why you would want to pick this over anything else, and so it's going to be a bad choice. The Jagdpanzer E100. This has the same ability of the E3. If you shoot it, its reload's going to go down by 5 seconds. That's very good, and 420 millimeters of heat is definitely going to leave an impact upon your opponents. With that said, it's really immobile. It's really hard to move around with this tank, and if you just want a glut of hit points, I think there are better options. So I'm not sure if I've never wanted to roll out with a Jägerroom. I think you could find some use with it, and so I'm going to stick it here with the E3 in the decent alternatives if you really have to do it. The E50M. The E50M is actually, I think, a very powerful tank in this situation. It's got one of the stronger abilities in the game. You basically get a constant reload boost, and you can get some really, really good rate of fire bonuses out of this. The E50 is one of the only 2 tanks in this game that gets that massive reload reduction, and so it makes it really powerful overall. I like that it gets APCR because it's able to penetrate through walls in the chaos of battle, and that's useful on several maps, and it's a lot more accurate than the 430U is, so it's going to have more flexibility at range compared to that tank. The armor is troll enough that in the chaos of a lot of movement, you're going to be able to bounce a few shells, and I would not underrate the ramming aspect of this tank. If you're able to run into the side of something like an E5, you can really rack up damage, and so the E50 is just a really, really dangerous tank in this game mode. I would waver between putting it in normally awesome and situationally OP. I'm not running these things on every map, but because I think it's good enough, I'm going to put it into the bottom of normally awesome. And E50 is just a really good tank in this mode. The mouse. The mouse is phenomenal on a couple maps. Something like Ensk. Your job, it's not even really doing damage. You just have to take in shells. It doesn't matter if they penetrate you. It doesn't matter if they bounce. Because you have 4,000 plus hit points, you are just tanking everything that comes in front of you. And so you don't want to stack these, but if you have one on your team and it's able to start pushes, I think this is a great choice. However, it's so slow, it's so immobile that I'm not going to run this on most maps, and so I think the mouse fits perfectly into situationally OP because this is just a blast to play on a few city maps, but outside of those situations, I don't think it's worth running. The E100 is not as strong as the mouse is in those particular situations, but it's more well-rounded. And I think if you play with 128mm, you've got enough hit points and enough damage per minute that this tank actually does become dangerous. This is not a tank I've been running at all, but I think it has a decent ability to sway a few games, and so I'm going to put this into the very top of decent alternative. I think this one, it's not quite overpowered, so I can't move it into situationally OP, but I think it's a very good choice for those of you who are looking to play a super heavy. And if you see one on your team, just know that it can do a lot of good work. The Leopard, this is a sniper medium tank, which means it gets the artillery ability, and the artillery ability is just so much weaker than a lot of the other medium tanks. You would much rather have this massive reload boost from something like an E50M. You'd much rather have the Inspire ability from something like the Patton, and the fact that this has no armor, it doesn't have the best damage per minute, and its mobility is nice, but there are tanks with better mobility, just makes this a bad choice. It's better than an E4, it's better than an M5, but you don't want to have a Leopard. There's many better choices. The Panzer VII, similar to an E100, but I think without the damage per minute. I'm going to throw it. I really don't want to have this in my game. If you've got to take a German heavy tank, you may as well take a mouse, take an E100. I think the Panzer VII is a bad choice, and I don't think you want to be playing it in this game mode. The Grill. The Grill has the sniper ability, which is fantastic on another tank that we're going to be discussing later. However, the Grill it's relatively slow to some of its sniper counterparts. It's way slower than a medium tank. Its gun, it doesn't have phenomenal damage per minute. It doesn't have great penetration. And if you get caught out, this armor is horrible. You will get demolished immediately. And so if you're purely camping in the back, and that's the only thing you're able to do, then this makes it just an awful choice. And because of its awful armor, because there are much better alternatives, even to fill the exact same role, this is a throwing pick. I never want to see a Grill on my team. It's an awful choice, and I'm going to leave it there. The T100 LT, like all light tanks, if the Rheinmetall didn't exist, this thing could be much stronger than it is. However, it is just outclassed by the HE rounds and the speed of the Rheinmetall. And so the T100, while it is a good tank, and you would want to have one of these if you didn't already have a Rheinmetall, this is going into decent alternatives, and I think it's right on par with the Sheridan. The T100 can get some troll bounces. The Sheridan has better damage per minute, and so it's a good choice if you don't have the better tank. The Object 268 version 4, this thing you really don't see a lot of. In previous versions of Onslaught, this thing was everywhere. However, in the current iteration, the Object 268 version 4 has just had a ton of nerfs laid upon it, and so I think this makes it a maybe decent alternative. If you really wanted to get pushing, I think this would be the best use of the breakthrough ability, where you get the engine boost and you're getting the reload buff. I think you could make it work, but I don't want to have one, and so I'm going to say it's a decent choice, maybe. The Object 268 actually has one of the rare abilities. You almost never see these in game. When you end up shooting tanks with the Object 268, if your ability is procced, it will actually boost your reload. So, for example, if you hit something like an E100 and you shave off 25% of his hit points, you will get right off the bat about a 20% reload boost. However, it gets much crazier if you end up getting kills, because if you get a kill in the Object 268, you are going to do an enormous amount of damage, because you will almost immediately reload your gun. And so you can, if you're chaining kills together, pop off multiple different shells. With that said, the Object 268 doesn't have great armor, it doesn't have great mobility, it's a bit of an all-rounder, and I've never seen somebody manage to make this work. And if I wanted to try to do this, I would pick a different tank. So I'm taking the Object 268 and I'm putting it in bad because it's so hard to get the dream scenario for this tank, and in all other ways it's just inflexible and not very useful. The IS-7 can be useful. It's got low damage per minute, so the IS-7's ability, you get depending how many teammates and the setup of your team, you get a pretty decent boost to all of your crew skills, but it's different than Inspire. With Inspire, from something like the Pattern, you are boosting your entire team, and that's what makes it phenomenal. In the i7, when you use your boost, you are only boosting yourself. And so because of that, its ability is just a lot weaker than a lot of the other ones on this list. Its armor is troll, and it can get in some hold down positions, and has the mobility to make some interesting pushes. So I'm going to leave this one actually in situationally OP. I think you could find a few use case scenarios for this, but they're pretty few and far between, so don't roll this on the majority of maps. The Object 705A, this thing has incredible armor when you're side scraping, but it's got poor damage per minute, it's got awful mobility, and it's really inflexible overall. This thing is completely outclassed by something like an E100 that would have more damage and I believe more health. And so in the setup, the dream scenario for this tank, it just doesn't exist. If you're just side scraping over and over and over, then you're going to get pushed by a mass of tanks or just ignored, and you don't have the mobility to really relocate to help your team. And so this is a bad choice, and you should not play it in this game mode. The ST2 is a tank that I wanted to love. The double barrel mechanic just seems really interesting. They buffed the armor on it recently, and you would think being able to chain 880 alpha would be really strong. It's got the team heal ability similar to the mouse, so it's able to heal everybody around it when you put in some damage. However, it doesn't have the incredible HP of the mouse. It has pretty mediocre damage per minute. You just feel slow every time you're shooting in this tank. And if you wanted to go hold down, there are better alternatives. And so I'm going to put the ST2 unfortunately into the bad category. I'd rather have one than a Panzer 7, but I think you'd get a lot of use out of much better heavy tanks. The 430U, this thing is really strong. It has the exact same ability as the E50M. You get that massive reload boost. Its armor definitely works. You can side scrape in it, and there's a lot of use case scenarios. However, I think the E50M has the advantage because you can ram things. Because of the APCR, it has the ability to go through walls, and the E50M is just a lot more accurate. I think you technically get higher damage per minute from the 430U, but I value the various different skills and tweaks that the E50M has over it, and so I'm going to leave the 430U In the normally awesome tier, I think this thing's great on city maps, but behind the E50M because I could see the E50M being used on more maps. The Object 140, I think this is a tank that time has really let go by. This thing used to be just the cream of the crop, and now it's just middle of the pack. It's got pretty good damage per minute, but it used to have amazing damage per minute, and that is just a little lackluster in today's meta. It does have the same inspirability as the Pattern, and because of the troll armor, because you can get some random bounces off your turret, and because it's got, I believe, better damage per minute than the Pattern, I'm going to leave this in a decent alternative with the caveat that there's going to be a much better option going forward. The 277, this thing is mobile. It can act a little bit like a medium tank, and so if you want to put some extra health onto a flank to help your mediums out, I think this one is a really great choice. I waffle back and forth between whether I'd want to have an IS-7 or a 277. The 277 is more mobile, it has worse armor, and so I'm just going to leave these essentially tied. It's user's preference between these two. I would rather have the IS-7, but I could hear the argument for the Object 277. The IS-4 is a decent tank. I think it's probably, by all accounts, an underrated tank by a lot of users. However, we're talking about Onslaught and not the game in general. And in Onslaught, the IS-4, it doesn't have the most health. It doesn't have incredible damage per minute. I think this suffers from a lot of the difficulties that the ST2 has. And so I would say, with much better options available to you, the IS-4 is just a bad choice, and I'd rather have an ST2 over it. The K91. The K91 is actually a tank I really want to love. This thing has phenomenal damage per minute. It's got an incredibly accurate gun, and I think this thing could have been situationally OP if it had a better ability. This is classified as a sniper medium tank, and so it gets the artillery strike, and that means it's just worse than the E50M and the 430U with their reload abilities, and it's just worse than the 140 and the Patton and another few tanks we're going to talk about later. The artillery strike, it's not a great ability. This thing doesn't offer you anything unique, and so I'm dropping this into bad. I think I would probably rather have a Leo over this thing, and so the K91, if it had the inspirability, I think has a chance to be used on a few snipey maps. It doesn't have it, and so it's going to bad. The T62A, there's no reason you would ever play this over a 140. This is a straight downgrade. It has really no upside whatsoever. If your team picks a T62A, that person's throwing, and so it's in garbage tier. The AMX 13105, this thing has a 3-round burst autoloader. However, it has the exact same ability as the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, that is the airplane scouting ability. And because you don't have anything to boost your damage per minute, this thing actually gets lower DPM than I believe all of the other light tanks that we've seen so far. And in these all-out brawls, you don't need just burst damage, you need continued sustained damage over time. And so I actually think not only does this mean that it's worse than the Panzerwagen, I think that the AMX is worse than the T100 and the Sheridan as well. I hesitate to call it a bad choice because it still has the scouting plane ability, which is really strong, and so I'm going to leave it just at the bottom of the decent alternatives choice. The AMX 30B, I've heard some reports of some people are using this. It has really surprising damage per minute. It's much better than you think. Its armor can be a little troll on the turret, although it's really bad overall, and the mobility just is not phenomenal. I think you could make this work. I don't think this tank is quite as bad as some people are making it out to be, but you've got better choices, and so this thing is going into the middle of bad. The AMX 50B, this tank has a little bit of a trollish whole armor layout. Some people would just expect a French tank to be completely squishy, and this thing can pull off a 1 in a million ricochet, but it's not consistent, it's not reliable, and I think it suffers from something that other tanks do as well. This thing gets the same reload boost ability that the T57 has. And so you're able to unload your entire clip in, I believe, 5.1 seconds from the first shot. and that's really good. You also get great accuracy, and you've got decent mobility. You've got more mobility than the T57 Heavy, and so I think the mobility aspect for me makes it a better tank for this game mode. However, I don't think it's overpowered in its matchups because once you unload your clip, your reload is so long and it keeps you out of the fight for way too long overall. And so I'm going to plop this right ahead of the T57 in the decent choices. This is a useful tank, but there are better options. The AMX M4 MLE54, this thing has just glaring turret weak spots, but it's got a painful gun to fight against. And if you're getting slapped for 560 alpha, you will regret some of your life decisions. I think this is a decent choice, but it's also just outclassed by a host of other vehicles, and because of that, it's getting dropped into the decent choices, and I'm going to stick it ahead of behind the E5 because I'd rather have the damage per minute. The Bat Chatillon 25T, this is my first tier 10 tank. I adored this thing for so long, but its reload is so painful, and 2.7 seconds interclip is just too slow for World of Tanks in today's meta. If this thing was spitting out shells every 2 seconds, it would be much better. 2.7 seconds is just too long, and if you want incredible burst damage, there are much better options than this. And so low health, low damage per minute, and even though you get a reload ability with it, the unload speed is just too slow for you to put in a clip and pull back safely. And so this actually makes the Bat Chat a bad choice in this meta. The MX-50 Foch B, this is not a tank that I ever roll out with, but I think it is very dangerous in the right hands. If you were able to set up this thing correctly in a 7-on-7 stack, I could see it absolutely ripping tanks apart. Its ability is a really funky one. You get faster speed going forward and backward by 10 kilometers per hour, and as long as you're at max rank, if somebody shoots you, you will heal a tiny sliver of HP, and then you will get a lot of health back based on how much damage they did to you. For example, if you pop the ability, roll out in front of a Jaegeru, and he shoots you for 1,000, at the end of the ability's use, you will heal about 800 health back, and that is really strong. However, you have to last until the ability is finished, and you don't get the heals back until the ability is done, and that can take far too long. And so I think this is a worse tank than an E100 or an Object 140 or a Patton, but I do think you could make it work with the correct setup. And so I'm going to put it in situationally OP because I could see this being very strong in the right hands of the user, but it's difficult. And so this is situational but really strong in a few use case scenarios. The EBR 105, I think a lot of people would consider the EBR 105 to be the strongest light tank in the game. It's just faster than everything else. However, in Onslaught, it's got an awful ability. The Rheinmetall Panzerwagen can pop its Air Scout ability, and it can instantly see what the enemy team is up to, and it can keep spamming that ability over and over and over and over. The EBR gets to boost its view range a little bit. That's terrible. That's terrible. It would be a great ability in the random queue. You would love to have an EBR with 500 plus meters view range, but when something like Rheinmetall Panzerwagen can throw out all spotting fundamentals whatsoever, it can eliminate all need for camo, the Panzerwagen is just much better. It can instantly spot whatever it wants, wherever it wants to, and the EBR actually has to drive and try, and it's completely outclassed by all the light tanks. This is a throwing pick, and it's an awful choice in this game mode. The Concept 5B has no armor, it has no damage per minute, it's a sniper medium tank, so it's got arguably the worst ability in the game in Onslaught. It's awful. I'd rather have an EBR than this thing. Straight to throwing tier. The Manticore, normally very good. It's got the best camo out of all of the tier 10 light tanks, and in the random queue, this thing is devastating. In Clan Wars, this thing is really strong. However, in a meta where you can fight against a Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, you are spamming different different airplane abilities, flight abilities at each other, and so camo is no longer an important factor in the general scheme of things. And because you can't use your camo effectively and safely, this makes the Manticore actually a weaker choice than all the other light tanks above it. I'm going to pop this not into throwing, but it's bad. You'd rather have an AMX, you'd rather have anything with a good gun over the Manticore. The Badger has incredible damage per minute, and its ability allows you, as soon as you get shot, so long as you're popping the ability, you will be instantly reloaded right away. Because the Badger's reload's about 5 seconds, anytime you get hit with a shot, you'll instantly be reloaded, and you can kind of spam shells out like that over and over and over. And so I think this makes this thing interesting. It's not something I've rolled out with, and its slow mobility really means that this thing is hard to use in a team context. With that said, I think you could make it useful, and without any glaring weak spots on the top, if you're able to go hold down, I think this is a decent alternative to a tank we're going to have coming up later on. And so don't hate the Badger just because you see it, but don't love it either. The Centurion Action 10, it's received a lot of buffs. It's got great gun depression, it's got phenomenal damage per minute, and it's got the Inspire ability. And because of this, it's just so flexible. It's got fantastic penetration, great gun handling compared to at least its peers. And when you've got that 0.15 accuracy boost, this thing can just snipe for days. It's fast, it's mobile, it doesn't have the best armor, but you'll ricochet a few. And so I'm actually going to put the Centurion as perhaps my favorite medium tank in this entire game mode. And I'm going to put it in the OP tier with the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen. The FV 4005 Stage 2. This thing has the same ability as the Foch B, which is if you take a bunch of damage and the ability ends, you'll heal it back. However, everybody, the moment they see you, is going to pop HE into your turret. You will instantly die. You will never heal that health back. This is straight throwing. It is worse than a concept because at least the concept could move a little bit. The 4005 is an instant throwing. It is the definition of throwing in your Onslaught game modes, and it's awful. The Super Conqueror, really strong tank. Its alpha damage is low for a heavy tank, but it's got fantastic damage per minute. This thing, I think, still has a very weak ability. It's got the ability of gaining a little bit of damage per minute back by shooting multiple targets, but then if you want to heal a tiny sliver of HP back, you've got to get rid of that damage per minute boost. And so the Super Conqueror, perhaps the strongest tank in the entire game right now in the random queue. In Onslaught, it's fantastic, but its ability is outclassed by others, and so I'm going to leave the Super Conqueror as an overpowered pick, but behind the Centurion Action 10 and behind the Rheinmetall, because I've got one heavy tank that I prefer over it. The TVP 5051 is dangerous. Its damage per minute is ridiculous with its boost ability. If you're able to put in 2 or 3 or hopefully 4 shells, then you will get a 65% reload boost for your clip. And so that means you're going to be putting in 4 shells in 4.5 seconds, waiting about 6 to 8 seconds after that to get back your entire clip, and then you're spitting out 4 shells again. And that means you can put out about 2,500 damage in just about 15 seconds. That's fantastic. And it means the TVP is incredibly dangerous and one of the priority targets on any map that you come across. However, it has no armor, it has no health, and it is a big target, and everybody knows that you've got a dangerous gun. It also lacks a lot of penetration, so it's hard to brawl with this thing, and you're going to be bouncing a lot of shells if you're using heat into the spaced armor of a Super Conqueror, and you're going to bounce a lot of shells, or at least have to aim a lot longer with the APCR. And so I think the TVP is a great choice, but it's risky as all get out. And so this is going into the situationally overpowered group because you can get phenomenal use out of it, but it's hard to utilize. The VZ55, I think this is just a decent choice. It can't go hold down as effectively as a Super Conqueror or some other tanks on this list. Its 2-shot blast is good, but it's not quite as strong as it used to be because it's got that half-sank ender clip added onto it. And I think the sticking point for me is that even though it's got great mobility, it's got low damage per minute for something in this game mode, and it's got less health than a lot of the tanks above it. And so I think it's a decent choice. You don't mind seeing one of these things, but it's not great. The Cranvon, I love this tank. This is one of my favorite tanks of all time. I 3-marked this thing at the height of its popularity, and I think this is my most played tank in World of Tanks overall. But it's so much worse than it was just a couple years ago. Its damage per minute has been slashed, and the fact that it's got the same ability as the 50B and the T57, it means you can spit out those shells every 1.9 seconds, but then you're stuck in that long clip reload. And so I think this makes it a decent choice. You can use it on a few maps that really require hold down usage, but you're just going to be better in a Super Conqueror. And so I'm going to put it at the bottom of decent alternatives. The Type 71. This is a new tank. Admittedly, I'm grinding towards it and have not played it. With that said, it doesn't have great damage per minute. Its damage per minute is okay. Its whole armor is awful, and it doesn't have fantastic health. And so in this meta, you'd much rather have a Super Conqueror, and I'm going to put this right down with the Cranvon at the bottom of decent alternatives. Can you do something similar to an E5? Sure, but you'd rather play an E5 or a Super Conqueror and just be better at it. The Ho-Ri. The Ho-Ri has the same ability as the Object 268, which is to say if you're getting kills, then you can get a massive reload boost and just combo shells. And since you're hitting for 700, that means if you get a kill, you can pop out 1400 damage in about 1 second. And that's great. I think what sets this apart from the Object 268 is this thing has a little bit of gun depression. It's got some armor that you can utilize on a few maps. And so while this isn't something I've used myself, and it's not something I've seen used very often in my normal matches, it is a tank I think you could craft a few strategies around. And because of this, I'm going to put the Ho-Ri at the top of decent alternatives. I'm not sure it's overpowered, but I'm going to leave the door open and say if you're a great Ho-Ri player and your team plays around it, I think you could use the gun depression and the damage per minute and that ability. I think you could do some amazing things, and I'm willing to change my mind as I play more in this game mode. The WZ1321 I think is the same as all the other light tanks, but just worse with lower damage per minute, and so I'm popping it right with all the other light tanks. The STB1 has lower alpha damage than the Centurion Action 10, and its whole armor is just atrocious. However, it's got the Inspire ability, and the Inspire ability is debatably the best ability in this game mode. I would say it's number 2, and so because of this, I'm going to stick the STB at it's normally awesome. I don't think it's quite as good as the Centurion Action 10. I'd rather have the accuracy of the scent, but the STB is a great choice, and you can get a lot of use out of it. The Type 5. If you're playing a Type 5, you should have played a mouse. It's bad, and it's going into the throwing class. The new BZ75. This thing has its rocket boost, and so it actually allows you to have a lot of mobility. And because the Onslaught game modes are so short, you're pretty much going to have these boosts whenever you want them, because you don't need to think too much about the late game. Its damage per minute isn't phenomenal. It's got the heal ability, which allows you to heal teammates as you go through. And so I think this goes right in line with a 277 or an IS-7. I would actually rather have the BZ75 over those tanks. However, if you're getting in a hold down scenario, this thing has just awful weak spots, and I know I've torn a few of these things apart, and so the BZ75 has to be used in an all-out brawl scenario. The 113. The 113, it's usable, but Wargaming removed it from the tech tree for a reason, and so it's just bad. You could have a much better selection than this tank, and that's what I would recommend. The 121 has actually a decent ability. I believe it's got the Inspire ability, and so with 440 alpha and the Inspire ability, this is a decent choice. However, I'd rather have a Centurion. You get gun depression that way. I'd rather have an STB. You're going to get some more mobility, and you're going to get better gun depression out of it. And I'd rather have a tank coming up later on in this list. And so because it's got that strong ability, I'm going to leave it as a decent alternative. Let's pop it right behind the T-57. But you've got better choices, and so just use those instead. The WZ-111 5A is a good tank overall, but it's not a great one. And this pretty much functions exactly as an IS-7 or an Object 277. And so for me, this is going right in front of the 121. It's a decent choice, but it's not amazing. The WZ-113 FT, I think some people would choose to make this in the throwing tier, but I actually think this thing can do a lot of damage in the right scenario. It's got more armor than I think a lot of players anticipate. It's got better mobility than you might expect, and this is in a similar vein to the 268 version 4. If you get shot, your reload goes down, and you can do a lot of damage as you go along. I'm going to stick the WZ into a decent choice. I think you could get some use out of it. I'm sticking it right with all the other Chinese tanks. The STRV 103B, phenomenal tank. This is situationally overpowered, and I'm going to put it actually ahead of the mouse. This thing unlocks a lot of different strategies that people don't think about. With the STRV 103B, on something like Outpost that's really bush map dependent, you are going to have camo all the time. You're almost never going to get spotted. And then you've got 4,000 or so base DPM. You get to boost that up by 35% whenever you're not spotted when you use your ability, and you have perfect accuracy. I talked about how the grill was an awful tank because it's got no armor, and while everything I said about the grill is true, it could be used if it wasn't for the STRV. The STRV has the exact same accuracy, perfect accuracy with the grill, but the STRV has better damage per minute. It has much better penetration, and you can just hit pixel shots all day long. People will be terrified to go in front of you because it's effectively getting shot by 2 tanks instead of 1 because of how quickly you're shooting. And so this thing is a monster on the right scenario. There are, I would say, 3 or 4 maps where this thing absolutely dominates. But outside of those maps, it really is a weak choice. And so I love you, Sturv. You're incredible in the right situation and the right hands, but you can't go into normally awesome or overpowered because it's just too situational for that. The UDES. The UDES is actually not a tank I've seen, I think, at all in this Onslaught season, but it actually has the Inspire ability. And so, whereas I would rather have the Centurion Action 10, I think the UDES is a fantastic alternative to that, and I think it's better than just a decent alternative. Its penetration is low, and you do want some of those hefty 340 heat penetration rounds in the right scenario. Plus, the Centurion Action 10 has Hesh, so it can boost its damage per minute even further that way. And so I'm going to leave the UDES in the normally awesome group because I think you could get a lot of value out of this tank. The CS63, this thing is borderline overpowered. It lacks the damage per minute that the tanks ahead of it have, and its artillery strike ability is not great. They're just much better choices than its ability. However, the ability to speed around the map faster than anybody else is really useful in a lot of different scenarios, and so this is my list. I think the ability for the Centurion matters a lot more than the CS63's speed does. And so for me, I'm moving this at the top of normally awesome because I'm going to roll out a CS63 in a lot of different maps. But that Centurion's Inspire ability is so strong, and so I'm leaving it there. 60 TP. I've been waiting on this one. This is one of my most played tanks. I think my second most played tank in this entire Onslaught season. It has lower damage per minute than the Super Conqueror, but I think it has a better ability. When you pop the ability, you're boosting only your own individual crew skills by a significant amount. It depends on who your teammates are, but in theory, best case scenario, I believe you can boost your crew skills by 77%, and suddenly your DPM is outclassing, I believe, a Super Conqueror's. It just gets nuts. However, what really sets it apart is the 750 alpha damage, because now you're slapping people for almost twice as much as a Super Conqueror. And I think your armor is just troll enough that you're going to get more bounces than a Super Conqueror. That lower plate is really weak, but it's hard to hit because it's so small and so skinny. And versus a Super Conqueror, maybe you absorb some heat rounds, but it's pretty easy to go through that lower plate, that huge lower plate, with ease. And so the 60 TP is my choice for the best tier 10 heavy tank in Onslaught. You could say that this thing is weaker on some maps than the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, but I would counter and say that I think you could run a 60 TP on every map. I think this works in so many different situations. I think it's so useful, and hitting for 750, backing off, and just leaving your opponents wounded is so important. You can play a little bit of hold down with it, you can side scrape a little bit in this thing, and I think it's the all-rounder that has really just popped off in this Onslaught game mode. If the Super Conqueror had a better ability, it would surpass the 60 TP. But the 60 TP's ability, I think, in my opinion, is stronger, and that's putting it at the top of my overpowered tier. The Progetto, it's got no armor. It's got reload boost, so this is the only auto reloader medium tank that's eligible in Onslaught. And so you can get up, I believe, to a 65% reload boost on your Progetto. However, that does not stack. It doesn't continue. You can chain some abilities in this game mode, and the Progetto is just not one of them. If you're playing this, you'd rather have a TVP, and because of that, I'm going to put the Progetto at, I'm putting it middle of bad. I would probably rather have a 30B and a Leo and a K91 over this thing, although I wouldn't rather have an E4. The Rinoceronte is bad. This thing gets the same ability as what you get in a Cranvon or a T57 or a 50B, and you might say it'd be awesome in the Rhino to be unloading every 1.6, 1.9 seconds for 500 alpha, and that's true. It would be great to do that, but the problem with the T57 and the 50B and the Cranvon is that their rate of fire, their true rate of fire, their damage per minute is barely going off. The ability that they have is shaving maybe 2.7 seconds off of your total reload. In the Rinoceronte's case, it's shaving off 1.8 total seconds off of an entire clip, and that's not enough to make a significant difference. Also, the Rinoceronte has terrible damage per minute. It doesn't have great armor, and it's just outclassed by everything ahead of it. If this thing had any damage per minute, it could rise up. But because it's got bad DPM and low-ish health for a heavy tank, it's going into throwing tier. I think you could get better use out of a Type 5 heavy and a grill than this thing. In fact, now that I'm looking at it, T62A is worse. There we go. Last tank on our list, the Minotauro. The Minotauro has the ability where if you shoot it, it takes 5 seconds off of its reload, and that includes both its regular reload, reloading the clip, and it includes its intraclip. So instead of shooting every 8 seconds, this thing could theoretically shoot every 3 or just instantly reload. It's also got the armor that it can get a fair amount of bounces, and so this thing is usable. You can get much better sniping out of an STRV. You can get much better hold down play and flexibility out of something like a 60 TP, but I think if you ran up against some dumb opponents, you could make the Minotauro work, and so I'm going to put this in the decent choices. I'm actually going to put it pretty high up because I think it's useful and usable, but there are better selections. In review, just taking a look at how I have ranked the tanks. I think the 60 TP provides phenomenal alpha damage for your team. It's just the backbone of almost all the lineups that I run, and I think it's very useful. Its penetration is a little low. It's definitely slow, but it's usable all the time, and it's great. The Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, those HE shells are just brutal. The fact that you can get a shot off, be spotted 1 second, get another shot off, you can just pester people to death, and your airplane ability will allow your team to move around and relocate around the map safely in a way that teams without a light tank just cannot. And so the Rheinmetall is phenomenal in this game mode. The Centurion Action 10, you could swap this with other tanks. This is my preference for the Inspire list. I've got my Centurion, my STB, my UDES, all in this tier because they've got the Inspire ability. Inspire is just so incredibly powerful, and I think you'll get phenomenal use and great games out of it. When you're inspiring, you're also getting your points up, and so that means that you will have huge games when you win. You'll get tons and tons of rank points, and if you lose, you're not going to lose that many because you will have been boosting your team all throughout the battlefield. The Super Conqueror, this is the most well-rounded tank, I think, on the entire overpowered list. You could take this, you really could take this on every single map. It's slow, that's its one downside, but it's got a really accurate gun, great damage per minute, and is incredibly useful. CS63, it's got a place with its mobility. You can rush a few positions, and you can flank around with incredible speed, and so I think this is normally awesome. However, the inspirability of the other tanks makes them better overall. The E50M and the Object 430U, they're really only there because of their damage per minute ability, which is really great. The STB and the UDES, it's all about Inspire. And then I'm going to talk about the tanks that I think are interesting here. The STRV and the Mouse, you can build strategies around them. The Mouse can push better than any other tank in this game mode on the city maps. The STRV is just a rock in place on several maps, and you can farm huge damage with it. The TVP, if you can stay alive, I think has the best damage per minute in this entire game mode, and it's incredibly dangerous. The BZ75 IS-7 277, you guys can rush into position, and it's very good. And the 50B, you could craft a strategy around this tank. Same thing for the Hori. I think you could make some situations work. You could forge your own path, and if you're able to make these things work, let me know. I think they could be incredibly strong. Thank you guys for watching. This has been a pretty large undertaking for a YouTube video for me. This is the first time I've done a tier list. It definitely takes a lot more time than a lot of my regular videos. And so, if you would, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe. I'm going to be releasing a lot more World of Tanks content going forward. I'm thrilled with the growth the channel has had over the last couple months, and I just want to keep this party going. With that said, I'm Lad, and I'm out.